Ladies and gentlemen, it's again my deep honor to welcome Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, one of the most brilliant minds and accomplished authors in the Jewish world today. He's been here at CBT multiple times, and we've developed a deep friendship. And I'm really, really honored to welcome you back to CBT, at least virtually with us today. I know your words mean so much to so many, especially during these times. And the stage is yours, Rabbi. Thank you again for joining us, and welcome to all.
Thank you, Reb Pinchas, and I always love spending time with you, and you're always doing imaginative work, and I'm very proud that you're my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. I
want to share with you some thoughts today on a book that I've started researching and putting together. And I want to really call the book Moral Imagination. And let me explain to you what I mean by that term and then give a number of examples of what I'm talking about. Extraordinary advances have been made in the last century, even more, in medicine and science and technology, because people utilize the full resources of their intellectual imagination to solve problems that had been previously thought to be insoluble. And when it comes, though, to moral issues, it's a mixed bag. There have been great advances in the last century in the status of women in society, the status of African Americans in societies. It is better at this point in history to be a person with physical disabilities than in the past. On the other hand, the last century unleashed the greatest amount of violence and murders in the history of humankind. Obviously, as Jews, we tend to think always of the Holocaust. But the number of murders committed by Stalin, by Mao, what happened in Cambodia. So it's been a mixed bag in that regard. What I want to try and do is to offer examples of what I mean of moral imagination in one's personal life, because we're sometimes limited in the amount we can do in the macro world, but what can we do in the micro world? And I mean by it, imaginative solutions. I'll give you a few examples that I've assembled over the years. I have a friend in Israel, Hanoch Teller. Rabbi, are you by any chance familiar with him?
Yes. And he's the Shlomo too, that you mentioned so often.
Oh, okay, great. So Hanoch was very much a disciple of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was considered really one of the great halachic authorities in Israel. And Hanoch related a case which he told me he actually knew the people involved. So this is not something he heard about from somebody who'd heard about it. This is he heard about it directly from the people. Two parents came to see Reb Shlomo Zalman. They had a child who was mentally, in terms of intellectual abilities, was challenged. And there had been a school in Jerusalem that had worked very well for him, but now he's getting to an older age. And there were no continuing schools in Jerusalem, but there were two possible residential schools elsewhere in Israel. And they asked Reb Shlomo Zalman, did he know which of the two would be better suited for their son? So he says to them, well, which one does your son want to go to? And the parents looked at each other abashed. They hadn't even thought actually to ask the son, and they didn't require his input. And Reb Shlomo Zalman said to them, Chatatem lenefesh hayelad, you're sinning against the soul of your child. Every day of his life, he has been living with you full time, and now suddenly you're going to drop him off at a school somewhere. He'll feel rejected. He could feel very, very hurt. Bring him to me. So the parents go home, they come back with the child, and he says to the young man, and he says, Akiva, and what's your name, Akiva? And he says something very surprising. He says, Ani Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Ani Gadol Hador. He said, I'm Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, I'm the greatest rabbi in the world today. Now this was very odd for Shlomo Zalman, who was known for being quite humble. He used to resent when people would address letters to him, Oker Harim, to the overturner of mountains. He says, the poor mailman just wants to deliver a letter. He doesn't want to have to start reading a whole paragraph. But he had already started speaking to the boy, and he saw that the boy knew quite a bit knew a lot about growing up in a religious household and knew about Shabbat, knew about Kashrut. So he said to the young boy, I want you to go with your parents and visit the two schools. And when you see the school that you prefer, I want you to tell your parents which one you want to go to, and I want you to go as my shaliach. I want you to go as my messenger to that school. And now comes the really strange part. He actually said, and I verified this for Chanoch, and he said, I want you to watch out for religious things in the school and all areas where you learn things where you can be helpful. And in order for you to do so, I'm going to give you smicha. I'm going to give you ordination. Chanoch told me that over the coming years, the boy often would not come home for Shabbat because he had a responsibility to be at the school. And who had given him that responsibility? The greatest rabbi in the world. That's an example of what I mean when I say by moral imagination. Now, an instance like that is unlikely to come up in our lives, but let me tell you of an instance that actually came up in my own life, why I consider it so important to tell people and for people to learn these stories, because sometimes what you learn in that story will actually come up and be relevant in your own life. This is a story told about Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, Yosha Ber, not the very famous contemporary rabbi who died only a few years ago, from whom I actually received smicha at YU, but it was told about his great-grandfather, after whom he obviously was named. One day, shortly before Pesach, so Rabbi Soloveitchik was sitting with some of his talmidim, his students, and a man enters, clearly seems to be a rather poor fellow, and he says to the rabbi, I have a question. Is it permitted to use milk instead of wine at the Passover Seder? So the rabbi first clarified, is there a health issue with wine? And he said, no, we're poor. We can't afford the wine. He gives the man 25 rubles and says, go and make a very nice Seder. When he leaves, one of his students says, Rabbi, 4 rubles, 5 rubles would have certainly been enough for the wine. And he said to him, don't you understand? If he wanted to use milk, it means he had no money for meat. It means he probably had no money for almost anything. Maybe all he could get was matzah. So what I learned from that story was sometimes giving enough, you have to learn when giving enough is not enough. How did it have relevance in I'm self-conscious telling this story is happening to me because it makes me look like a bigger tzaddik than I am. And maybe in future speeches, I've written, I won't say it, but it actually did happen with me. Devorah, my wife and I were very close with an elderly woman who was a Holocaust survivor, and one of those Holocaust survivors really who had never achieved any financial success. She was quite a poor woman. And she was having terrible back pains, and she's somebody who was very, very dear to us. And I said at a certain point, because she was not a complainer, I said at a certain point, there's nothing they can do for your back? She said, well, there is a medication, but even though she was already on Medicaid, there still was a copayment of $60. Devorah and I, later that night, gave her a check for $1,000. And I did it because of that story. Because I remember I was thinking, if she's in such terrible pain and doesn't have $60 to buy medication that could relieve that pain, who knows what else she's denying herself. But I would not have come to that conclusion had I not known that story about Rabbi Soloveitchik. I would have probably done what most of us would do, give her $60, $70, $80. I would have asked, because she was a humble woman. She was not going to be the sort who's going to ask for more. And it then affected our ongoing relationship with her, because sometimes you realize giving enough really is not enough. And that's why I want to really start implanting these stories of moral imagination where we use the resources of our intellect. Obviously, you have to have a sympathetic heart to which you would try and do it. Another aspect of moral imagination, and by the way, after I finish, I'll gladly stay on for a few minutes if people want, to further discuss it. And guess what? I'm looking for stories. I'll give anybody, I'll give you my email if anybody has moral imagination stories. And if I end up using yours, obviously I'll quote it by next. I want it quoted by now. Here's another one. Very often, somebody is doing something wrong, and we might criticize it. And the likelihood that our criticism will take effect is mixed. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. But I came across, I think it was a Catholic textbook, but I'm not sure. It was in a medical textbook. A professor of medicine was lecturing to a class of medical students, and he was making the point that no matter how grave a person's illness is, no matter how bad the prognosis is, you should never take away all hope. You should always give somebody some hope. So one of the students in the class, a young man, raised his hand and he said, I don't think that's our job as doctors. Our job as doctors, we should be men of truth. If we have nothing really encouraging to say, we shouldn't say it. So the professor, and wait for the punchline of the story before you start reaching conclusions. The professor said to the young man, he said, I think that attitude disqualifies you from being a doctor. I think you should be thrown out of the school. So the kid was obviously in shock when he said it, and just sort of stayed frozen in his seat. But then the professor said, no, I'm serious. I want you to go downstairs. I want you to tell the dean of the medical school that I'm recommending that you be thrown out of the school. The kid had no choice. He started to stand up and walk towards the door. Before he got to the door, the professor said to him, okay, you can sit down now. I just wanted you to experience for a minute what it's like when you're deprived of all hope. Believe me, I think if anything could have an effect on somebody's behavior, a story like that. Strangely enough, and what I'm going to tell you now actually happened to me. Some years later, I was giving a lecture. I don't know, because there's an institution that doesn't come out sounding very good in the story, I will keep it anonymous. But I'm giving a lecture for a very wealthy family that brought me in to lecture, and I'm going to mention where. It was at a university. And going home, the woman told me that some years earlier, her husband had gone to a very well-known cancer research center, medical center, and the doctors gave him such a negative prognosis, totally without hope. Basically, what the doctor said to him was, just settle all your affairs, make sure everything's taken care of, and just go home and drink a lot of whiskey. She said her husband came home utterly destroyed. They went to a local medical school, which obviously had a hospital affiliated with it. And there they said, look, this is a tough cancer you have. We have a lot of new things that are being developed. We're going to try everything out. And she said they just stayed with him and held his hand through the rest of it and gave him whatever hope they could. And they always assured him they were going to work very closely with him. And the punchline to the story, and that's how I know it was true, because it was in the newspaper the next day, they had just announced a $100 million gift to that medical school. I always wondered if they ever sent the story back to that doctor who had originally deprived him of all hope. So that's another thing. And we know the famous statement in the Talmud, even if you have a sword against your throat, try and hold on to some hope. Coronavirus. Also, I have a philosophy that's affected me a lot, even more in recent years. Even when nothing can be done, something can be done. And we have to think in terms of that. I got a phone call from a friend of mine, a woman named Sarah Horowitz. There is a woman in New York named Sarah Horowitz, who was the first woman rabbi who Avi Weiss had ordained. And this is another woman named Sarah Horowitz, who had been the chief speechwriter for Michelle Obama, and who in the last few years got very, very interested in Judaism. She had had an upbringing that didn't make her so excited about Judaism, but now it's become very important in her life. And she said, I'm writing a story for the Washington Post. I heard a story. Was it from you? And it turned out it really wasn't from me, but it turned out to be true. One of the sad things that's happened since the coronavirus is people can't go to funerals. They can't go to the cemetery. How many of you, since the virus happened, has had a funeral, do by a show of hands, that you haven't been able to attend? Well, certainly as a rabbi, it's going to come up more often. So, and of course, one of the moving things that happens at the end of a cemetery, at the end of a burial in Jewish tradition, is that the mourners form two lines, and the people who suffered the loss walk between, not the mourners, the people attending the funeral form two lines, and the people who suffered the loss walk between them, and people call out, they can call up Hamakom Yinachem, may God comfort you among all the mourners of Zion and Israel, or just any words of comfort and consolation. So at a synagogue, a large synagogue, I have to track down the information. What they did was, before the funeral, 30 friends of theirs, 30 cars came to the parking lot of the synagogue, and they formed two lines. And the people who had suffered the loss didn't walk. They actually drove between the two lines as people called out the words of consolation. I'm sure it was very, very moving to the people who happened. And that's why I said we should always think in terms of that fact. Even when nothing can be done, think of what you can do, because we can't give up hope. I'm just going to close with two other thoughts about it. Ezu chacham halomed mikol adam. Who's wise? There are actually two very interesting times, and Rabbi Alush, if I'm missing one, you'll tell me if there are others. In the Talmud, there's the famous, are people muted or unmuted?
Muted.
Okay.
Unmute
So
them.
I'll just do this, and then when I finish, let's unmute.
Okay.
Okay, so the Talmud raises the question in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers, at the beginning of the 4th chapter. They ask a whole bunch of questions with surprising answers, or in some ways unexpected answers. Ezu chacham, who is wise? Halomed mikol adam, one who learns from everyone. And then elsewhere in the Gemara, it's answered as Ezu chacham haroeh hanolad. Who's wise? One who sees the future consequences of his actions. So I tend to read fairly widely. You know, obviously, most of my reading's in Jewish-related areas, but also in other areas as well. And I was reading a book. I've written a couple of screenplays, so that whole world interests me. And one of the actors who I've always liked a lot is Michael Caine. How many of you are familiar with Caine? Any of you? You know, excellent actor, right. And he wrote about lessons he's learned in life. And one of them is very moving. And if any of you have issues with anger, it could be very helpful to you. Caine said that as a young man, he had a bad temper. And he would sometimes, you know, and sometimes the bad thing in life is as you become more prominent, you can get away with more bad behavior. So sometimes on a set, he would throw a fit. And he did it once on a set. Somebody had done something, had messed something up, and the writer of the novel on which the film was based was a man named James Clavell. And after Caine calmed down a bit, but it was going to take a little while to they would resume filming, he said, Mike, let's go take a walk. And he took a walk with him. And Clavell had spent some years in Japan in a very unhappy circumstance. He had been a prisoner of war, but somehow he was not as badly treated as some of the other prisoners. And he said one of the things he learned in Japan is that people, as a rule, really don't throw. If somebody throws an angry temper tantrum, it very much lowers respect for them. You know, and it's true. Sometimes when you see somebody throwing a fit, they really look terrible. And Clavell, and Caine said the way Clavell explained it to him, that you lower regard for yourself, it actually affected him. But one of the lessons he took away also from Clavell, and this is important to us, and I'm sort of summarizing it, it's not exactly his words, never yell at somebody who's not in a position to yell back at you. He says to do so is to take a monstrous advantage. If you have to criticize somebody, criticize them. If you have to be sharp, sharp. But there's something unfair about taking advantage of your status in a situation and yelling at somebody, because it's, as a general rule, it's very humiliating to be yelled at. I think parents, you know, have to be careful. Certainly, it's not a good thing with your children, and certainly you got to be careful what you said. So that was one thing I learned. And as the other example of Ezu Chacham Haroeh Hanolad, who is wise, one who foresees the future consequences of his act. I'll give you an interesting example about someone you probably don't normally hear stories like this told about. I grew up in a pretty typical Orthodox Jewish household in Brooklyn. I was born in 48, so you don't have to waste time figuring out. I'm 71 now. And I remember in the elections in the 50s, there were two elections. Both times, Dwight Eisenhower was elected president. Can figure out how many other people here still remember when Eisenhower was president. Okay, a few of us. Okay. And Eisenhower twice lost in his campaigns to Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson really was a bit of an intellectual, and Eisenhower, I only realized later, was smarter than he was often given credit for. And when the Allies started to liberate the concentration camps, Eisenhower, Patton didn't want to go. Patton said, I'll get too sick if I go into a camp, because there were corpses there. We know what the emaciated victims looked like. And Eisenhower had the foresight to say at that time, he said, I'm going on a careful inspection of the camp, lest there ever arise in the future a tendency to say that this was mere war propaganda and this wasn't really true. That's an Ezu Chacham Roeh Tanolad. That's one, a wise person who sees the future consequences of his action. Now, Eisenhower certainly was not considered a great intellectual. And in studies that they've done of academics who are very often cited in studies, one of them is actually a Jew by birth. I don't know to what extent, how much he identifies as a Jew, but Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky has actually allowed his writings to be used as a preface to a book by a French anti-Semite called Foresson, denying the Holocaust. He said he's doing it for free speech, but to realize that by doing it, he's also giving a certain credence to it. And, you know, can you imagine somebody write a book that Black people actually enjoyed being slaves? Who would write a preface to such a book? And so, you know, here you compare someone like Eisenhower, who was able to foresee the future consequences and that Holocaust denial would start, compared to someone like what Chomsky is doing. Okay, I'm going to give one last example. I don't know, what time is it? Okay, I'm going to give one last example. If any of you know any particularly wealthy Jews who are looking to give an award and start an award, I would love this to come out of the Jewish community. One of the beautiful stories that's told in the very opening chapter of Shmot, of Exodus, is about Shifra and Puah, the two midwives who refused to obey Pharaoh's order to kill the Jewish male babies that are being born. Now, there is a famous Rashi, and there is one tendency in Jewish life to claim Shifra and Puah that they were actually Jewish women. It doesn't say that in the Torah, and I don't know why the Torah would conceal it. If it does, it is in Rashi, so I'm saying it is there, but for a variety of reasons, I believe Shifra and Puah were not Jews, and makes the story even more moving. I thought some Jewish organization should underwrite an annual Shifra and Puah award, and I already know who the first recipient should be. Dr. Li Wan, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, the Chinese doctor who tried to make known early on what the coronavirus was doing, and who was stopped by the Chinese authorities. They claim that he himself later on died of coronavirus. We have no idea if that's what he died of. It would not be beyond these people to have murdered him for doing it. And that's a very powerful story. You know what? Okay. I don't want to end on with such a sad story. I wanted to get an award. Okay, so I'll give you one other story.
Take your time, Rabbi.
What?
If you have more, it's fine also.
Okay. No, this is just some of the early material I've been coming up with, which is why I'm very excited about it. In 1895, the police commissioner of New York City was Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt, of course, only 6 years later, had become the vice president under William McKinley, and upon McKinley's assassination, he became president of the United States. But in 1895, he was the police commissioner of New York City, And there was a substantial German community in New York, German non-Jews, some of whom were anti-Semites. And they had invited a preacher, I'm forgetting his name, but they had invited a preacher who was a well-known anti-Semite to come to New York and to give anti-Semitic speeches. The Jewish community in 1895 in New York was much smaller than it subsequently became, but it was already becoming somewhat of a community, a bigger community. And a number of the more prominent Jews went to Roosevelt. He was the police commissioner, and they said, we're asking you, don't give this guy the permit to speak, and don't give him police protection. So Roosevelt, who it came out later was a philo-Semite, really liked Jews. Roosevelt said to them, he said, I don't know legally if I can deny them the permit. And even if I could do it legally, I don't think it would be wise. You'll turn him into a martyr. Our goal should be to make him look ridiculous. So what Roosevelt went ahead and did, he indeed sent a high police official along with 20 policemen to his speech. All of them were Jews. The man was giving these annoying, terrible speeches, and the only ones who were there to protect him were Jews. Obviously, it made him look a little ridiculous. So what I'm saying is, if we can start using our intellects in a very dynamic, exciting way to solve problems, and that's what we can all really learn from each other. That's what we can really learn, to learn from other people ways to act in unexpected situations. And that's the wisdom we can really share with each other. And if you want to unmute, I'm willing to take some questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Telushkin. Really, as always, your words resonate so deeply and inspire us to action.
Thank you.